On January 26th, 2011, just as the last traces of daylight slipped beneath the Philadelphia skyline, a woman had been found dead in her apartment, a potential self unalive. I'd seen my fair share of self unalive, enough to know that even the most straightforward cases often had layers. Something about this one nagged at me from the start. The woman's name was Ellen Greenberg, a 27-year-old elementary school teacher. Her fiancé, Samuel Goldberg, had found her in their apartment, lying in the kitchen. She had a knife in her chest, and blood pooled around her, staining the floor a deep crimson. Samuel's 911 call was frantic, filled with shock and disbelief. He claimed the door had been locked from the inside when he arrived home, forcing him to break it down to get in. That fact alone set off alarm bells in my head. When I arrived at the scene, the air felt heavy, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. Ellen lay on her back, a knife plunged deep into her chest. It looked bad, worse than bad, really. At first glance, it appeared like a typical self unalive, but as I took in the scene, something about it felt wrong. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry beyond the door Goldberg had broken down. The apartment was eerily tidy, too neat for the chaos that should accompany a violent death. The medical examiner arrived quickly, and as they moved Ellen's body, more details emerged. Details that turned this case from a presumed self, unalive, into something far more sinister. Ellen hadn't just been stabbed once. She had been stabbed 20 times, 10 times in the back of the head and neck, and 10 more in her chest and abdomen. The brutality of it made my stomach churn. I had seen self unalive as before, but this wasn't a clean, controlled act of desperation. This was chaos. This was madness. I began to question Goldberg, who sat pale and shaking in the next room. He repeated his story, how he had returned home from the gym to find the door locked from the inside, how he had tried to reach Ellen, but when she didn't answer, he broke down the door to find her lifeless body. His shock seemed genuine, but I couldn't help feeling something was off. If the door was locked from the inside, how could anyone else have gotten in? Could Ellen have really done this to herself? We processed the apartment, gathering evidence. There were no defensive wounds on Ellen's hands, no signs that she had fought off an attacker, but there was something that kept bothering me: the sheer number of stab wounds. People don't typically stab themselves in the back, let alone 10 times. It felt too extreme, too violent for a self unalive, and yet every physical detail pointed to the fact that no one else had been in that room. I started piecing together Ellen's life. She was engaged, planning a wedding, seemingly happy. But friends mentioned she had been dealing with anxiety in the months leading up to her death. She had even seen a psychiatrist who prescribed medication. Her parents, Joshua and Sandy Greenberg, were adamant that she wasn't self-unalive. They described Ellen as warm, compassionate, and excited about her future. The more I learned, the less sense it made. As the investigation continued, we waited for the autopsy report, hoping it would provide clarity. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. The report confirmed what I had suspected. Ellen's wounds were not consistent with a typical self unalive. In addition to the stab wounds, there were bruises on her body that suggested she had been restrained. And then came the detail that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The knife had been plunged into her chest with such force that it had penetrated her heart. The likelihood of someone inflicting such a wound on themselves was almost impossible. Despite all this, the case took a strange turn when the medical examiner ruled her death as a self-unalive. I couldn't believe it. The ruling left me stunned, as if the ground beneath me had shifted. How could they ignore the evidence? The numerous stab wounds, the bruises, the locked door, none of it added up. I kept pushing, following every lead, hoping to find something that would prove Ellen hadn't done this to herself. Her parents were relentless, refusing to accept the official ruling. They hired independent investigators, forensic experts, anyone who could offer an alternative explanation. But with each passing day, the case grew colder. The twist: despite all the evidence suggesting foul play, the death of Ellen Greenberg remains officially ruled as a self unalive to this day. Her parents continue to fight for the case to be reopened, convinced that their daughter was murdered. They believe that someone, maybe even someone close to her, killed Ellen and staged the scene to look like a self-unalive, knowing the locked door would cast doubt on any other possibility. I'm left haunted by the unanswered questions, the wounds, the locked door, the fiancé's story. It all lingers like a shadow over my mind. Every piece of evidence points in different directions, and yet none of them lead to a clear conclusion.